Welcome to our special conversation today. My name is Melissa Fleming, and I am the Undersecretary General for Global Communications at the United Nations. Today, you join us at the United Nations Bookshop at United Nations headquarters here in New York, and we come together to mark Yom HaShoah and the 80th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising on the 19th of April in 1943. It is my pleasure to introduce to you on this occasion four special guests. To my right, I have Edith Tenenbaum Shapiro, and to my left, Selma Tenenbaum Rossen, and we have Edith's son, Mark Shapiro, and Selma's grandson, Alex Rossen. Every year, the United Nations Holocaust and United Nations Outreach Program marks Yom HaShoah, the solemn day of remembrance. And this year we mark it with a new series called In Conversation, where we will have conversations with survivors, but also their children and their grandchildren about history, about memory, and about home and belonging. The In Conversation series is organized by the Holocaust and United Nations Outreach Program and is part of the United Nations Outreach Program on the Holocaust, guided by the 2020 theme, Home and Belonging. Through the In Conversation series, we hope to hear from survivors, their children and grandchildren, about what it means to them to have a history in the Holocaust. A history of enduring terrible atrocities, of witnessing genocide and surviving it. So close to the family. Through the In Conversation series, we hope to hear what it has meant to the survivors to carry this story. This history is seen as challenging fundamentally to all notions of morality and all notions of humanity. A history that has given impetus to a body of international law designed to prevent such terrible atrocities from ever taking place again. So what does it mean when such a world shaping history has shaped your very family? As parents, how do you begin to tell this story to your children? How, as children, do you learn to care for your parents whose childhoods and younger years were so very different from yours? And then, as the grandchild of survivors, does this history still hold the same weight? These are just some of the questions we hope to pose to the family here today and to engage in conversation with them about the ties and experiences that shaped their lives. I'd like to begin by turning to both Edith and Selma. Edith and Selma, you were born in Zloczów, in what was then Poland. I think today it is Ukraine. To Samuel and Elizabeth. Elizabeth was known as Lena Tenenbaum. Edith, you were born in 1935 on your grandfather's birthday, and Selma, you were born in 1936. Yeah. I'm going to ask you if you could tell us a little bit, each of you, and maybe building on what the other said, what your lives were like before the war, and just a bit about your parents and your grandparents, because I think they were all quite extraordinary. Would you like to start, Edith?
Yes, thank you. I have memories of a very wonderful early childhood. I was about, I think, 4 years old when the war broke out. But until then, lived in a lovely house with my parental grandparents, young, handsome, lively parents, lots of fun activities. I put these beads on today because one of my absolutely earliest memories is of my grandmother whom we called Lola. Her name was actually Laura. Grandfather was Leon. Grandmother Lola had a box of jewelry that was full of coral and amber beads. And she said that when Selma and I grew up, we would have those. Well, of course, that's not what happened. These disappeared as wartime loot. But Selma and I were in Krakow about 20 years ago, We went to an antique store and we saw these beads and she bought them for me. So I always wear them in commemoration.
So the actual beads are gone, as we know, probably, and we'll learn how. What are some of maybe a little anecdote of your memory as a child?
Well, this was a little different from Edith. I was a critical year younger, and I remember very little. I do remember living in this big house. I remember the maids stuffing geese in the kitchen to make foie gras, and I remember them putting straw in burlap bags on the doors to keep the house nice and warm. But I don't have too many memories besides that.
You were, both very small.
Yes.
If you were to describe, though, maybe what home meant to you at that stage, how would you?
It was very secure.
How about you? What did home mean to you?
Well, later in life, I came across the idea of a lost paradise. And I thought later, this is not recent, a long time ago, that to some extent that's what I felt when the war changed everything. I have many more memories of being at the theater, of seeing Ukrainian girls, like the Rakettes, dancing with those red boots shooting up in the air, wonderful family gatherings. So many, many memories. I guess a year's difference is a big difference at that point in life.
A lost paradise from the eyes of a little girl living in a secure lifestyle. You wanted to add something?
Yes, I think I was very ill when I was a little over a year old, and maybe that had an effect of my not having these good memories.
I don't know how much we all remember about that early childhood, but I think it's that feeling and that sense of security that you remember that that's so important. And when did that sense of security end for you?
I remember when, and that's actually when the Russians came in. It was in 1941, and we had to leave the house where we were born. And we were walking in the rain. There was no umbrellas to this new place we don't live in, and I remember being very scared.
Very scared. So all of a sudden, the Russians were coming in. You invaded. You had to leave your home. What do you remember from that?
Actually, the chronology is a little bit different. The Russians came in 1939, and we're not going to spend time on this today, I know, but they really were chapter one. They drove us out of our house and our parents of their professions and so forth. What Selma was talking about, when the Russians were retreating, we were, actually even before they were retreating, at some point they threw us out of our apartment. And so we were moving to another place. And interestingly enough, I don't remember that at all. It's not a shared memory. I don't remember the walk. I know we were thrown out.
Thrown out as the Russians were retreating, did you have any inkling of the new danger that would come from the Germans?
I don't think we did, the children. But
your parents were doing quite a lot to prepare to keep you safe. Do you remember any of those preparations to find the best route? That was much later.
Later, I think when we moved into the new apartment, I don't remember. Well, actually, when the Russians would retreat, well, it's the history. Germans and Russians had a non-aggression pact, as you know, and then the Germans turned on the Russians, and it was at that point that the Russians were driven out, and the Germans came in, and that's what Selma's referring to. At that point, there were some bombings and all kinds of scary things happening.
So your world turned very different. You had to move a few times. That sense of security was no longer there.
And I remember the grown-ups talking about the Germans coming. And I remember Mrs. Yeller, she was actually the mother of one of our friends, coming and saying she saw a German soldier and he gave her a basket of eggs. So maybe they're not going to be as bad as what we expected. And that was in 1941. And soon after, the troops came in and the shooting started. So in the first few days that the Germans came into our town, which was 1941, we had to hide. Father's factory had an attic, and we had to hide in that attic for a few days, so we could hear all the shooting outside. And it was very scary. It was very scary. But you know what children are like. I was kind of wondering if there was a bathroom around. You know, what does one do in a situation like that? And Mother said, you just go in that corner, and that was of the attic. And that was very disconcerting to me.
There's those moments when you realize there are no longer any comforts of home.
Right.
I'm sure there's certainly no longer any school, and you were hiding in the factory that your father once owned?
No, the factory was owned by our grandfather, and the business was making supplies for the pharmaceutical industry, boxes and other kinds of containers. And when we were little, before the war, we used to sneak down there, and the factory was on the lower floor of my grandparents' building. So we lived upstairs, so we used to sneak down and hang out with the quote girls, the young women who were making all these items. And but of course, all that changed with the leaving of the Russians and the Germans coming in. And I remember the first action, the first episode where the Germans started killing Jews. And as Selma said, we hid in the factory, we hid in the attic. And I remember that very well, too. But what I also remember, and I want to make a point of, is that, people talk in abstractions and numbers. Now, our parents were married young. We were the first kids in the crowd. Our parents were only children. We had a lot of honorary uncles and aunts. And one of our most beloved honorary uncles was murdered in that very first action. Do you remember that?
What do you remember about your uncle's death?
Honorary uncle.
Honorary uncle.
Actually, I hate to tell you this, but I was a colicky child. I was doing a lot of crying when I was young. And I remember he drew a picture of me with a dog in my stomach. Do you remember that? Yeah, right. But he was very comforting. He was very nice. And the fact that he was gone, which we knew very quickly, was very, very disconcerting.
Is that the moment you realized things were really dangerous?
Well, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I realized life had changed dramatically when the Russians came in, or just before that, because we were in the park with Mother and some friends, and Selma and I were hanging out with them, and Mother and her friends were sitting in a cafe talking and ignoring us. And Selma got bored, I don't know if she remembers this, and said she wanted to go to the sandbox. But Mother wasn't paying any attention, and then when Selma repeated what she wanted, Mother told her to dig in the flower bed. I was outraged. I knew we don't do things like that. I must have been learning how to read at that point, because it said, do not, disturb the flower beds. So I took off. I ran away. I went home. And they followed after me, and you can imagine this was not a celebratory occasion when they came back. But I date my realization that something was different to that moment, that Mother could just sort of wave us away and not pay attention to the rules.
They were busy with other.
The women were preoccupied. Later I heard that Father heard on the radio that morning that the Germans had broken through. And go ahead, Selma, I'm sorry.
There was a follow-up story which takes place a couple of years later, which is my sister again running away, and that was when the Germans were there, and you had these actions, and Father and Mother were protected because they had work permits, when we were living there, but the children were not. And the children, and we now know that our parents, who were in their early 30s, were desperate to save us. So they tried to find some Christian friends that we could be with. And I'm jumping a little bit ahead of the story. And so they did find a Christian couple that took Edith and me. And I do remember being there, and they put together 2 chairs, and I slept on it, and they put a blanket over my nose because I was very Jewish looking. Edith was fair, I was not. So we were there for that action, and then afterwards, they told our parents that they were willing to take Edith, but not me, because I was too Semitic looking. I didn't know why, but I know only Edith was acceptable. So that's the second time. She jumped out of the window.
Why did you do that?
Well, there was I was taken back to this young couple's apartment. By the way, very luxurious, very nice. But my sister wasn't there, and she was, of course, my other half. But I behaved myself until I slept there or stayed there overnight. Next morning, the man said to me that his wife isn't feeling well, so he's going to take her out of town, and that I should stay put. I was maybe 6 years old then. The maid was coming any minute, and I shouldn't worry, and everything would be okay. Well, the maid never showed up. Barry, you look surprised. You didn't know this? I thought we told you everything. Okay. The maid didn't show up, so I was wandering around the apartment, I think through the afternoon, and then I had enough. I looked out of the window. I did do that, and the street was quiet, so I found the nearest window I could find, and I climbed out, and I knew that the family was hiding. At this point, long story, but they were no longer able to hide in the factory. The woman who had allowed them to do that got scared. So I knew they were hiding in a bunker somewhere nearby. I knew exactly where it was. So I jumped out of the window, ran to the bunker, banged on that door. Later I heard that the people thought that was the end. This was, they thought they had been discovered. But nobody heard. They opened the door, pulled me in. And that was the end of my being without my sister.
So you were together throughout
Right.
horrible period.
Yes, but our parents tried once again to see if somebody would take Edith and me. And that was to our nanny, Hania. And I didn't want to go, but they bribed me. They said they were going to have these noodles with poppy seed on them. And I like noodles with poppy seeds. So we went to our nanny, but I thought that the noodles would be stuffed with poppy seeds, but they were not. They were just sprinkled on top of the noodles. Yeah, I know, in the midst of war, you have this. So I was crying, and then Edith joined me in crying. And after a few days, the nanny gave us back to our parents. So I really give my sister a lot of credit for keeping our family together, because Mother said, we're going to either live together or not live together. But she didn't try giving us away again.
Well, she was trying to give you a way to save you, but I think it must have been extremely trying, and also for them. I believe your mother was an amazing woman, especially for that time. She was a lawyer?
Yes, both our parents were lawyers. They had studied together. But in addition, Father was involved in his father's factory because his mother insisted on it. He was an only child. And that, as it transpired, turned out to be what saved us. The fact that Father stayed at that factory, the various invaders needed to print shops so they could print proclamations and things. And Father was the only one, I gather, who could manage the equipment. I don't mean physically, but to run the show. So father did that with the Russians and then with the Germans also.
And that saved you.
There was a Ukrainian woman who was made director of the factory. She was a survivor. She did it with both the Russians and the Germans, and but she relied on father. She'd worked in the factory before, so for a while she went along with father's insistence that we and other people hide there. But eventually she'd had enough, and the story took a different turn. I know we're only telling you the funny anecdotes, but there was some pretty grim times too.
I think maybe it is important to highlight a couple of those anecdotes just to paint the picture of how terrifying it must have been as well.
It was. And, when I think that my parents were in their early 30s then, how they protected us and they taught us through all of this. We always had lessons, how to read, how to write, history lessons. And they kept us entertained all the time. I can only remember my father breaking down one time, and that was terrifying. And that was after the ghetto was established, and there was a lot of typhus in the ghetto. And we did, there's a story in that which Edith will tell you, permission to live outside the ghetto. But my grandmother was with me, and she caught typhus. She was typhus, and she died. And it was recognized that Edith really understood more than I did what was going on, so they sent her out of the apartment at that point. But I was there when father's mother died of typhus, and it's the only time during the whole war that I can remember my father breaking down and really crying when they lifted her out of bed. And I remember that was...
Of course, I mean, children, and we'll talk about that a little bit later because we have Edith's son, as I mentioned, and your grandson here. We also have many members of your family who are here to watch this recording. And I know as children, you look to your parents. If the parents are holding it together, then you think maybe things are going to be all right.
And they certainly were. I mean, now as an adult, when I look at it, they were incredible. Yeah.
You were, in the last 18 months of the German occupation, you were hidden in a village by a Polish woman and her 2 Ukrainian tenants. I understand. How did that come about? What was that like?
Well, after it became clear to our parents that we would not separate. Long story, but maybe we should have told you this before. During the Russian occupation, the Russians considered our whole family a persona non grata, meaning suspicious people, because they were, quote, intelligentsia and bourgeoisie. And as I said earlier, they were the first ones to chase us out of our house. But as it turned out, they were focused more on my grandfather than my father, and the threat was deportation to Siberia. So to avoid that, our paternal grandparents that we lived with went to stay in Lviv, that you're hearing about now, a city about 50
Lviv in now Ukraine.
That is correct. About 50 kilometers more we were. Father made every attempt to bring them back during the German occupation and succeeded in bringing his mother back, but the grandfather not. So apparently grandfather had some contacts with the Polish underground, and he suggested to father, that's one version I heard. I'm not sure exactly what the sequence of events was, but grandfather was involved in getting us Aryan papers. And the plan was that we would use these fake papers and go to Warsaw, where nobody knew us. And because Selma raised the question of her Semitic appearance, it was a very much more sophisticated city. There were more kinds of people there, so it would be easier to pass. So that was the plan, but the Germans decreed otherwise. So you can tell that part of the Hella story.
Well, the courier who was supposed to deliver the forced papers to us did not make it. And mother had some money that was supposed to be given to him. And this Polish woman, Helena Szczeszewska, Hela, we vacationed at her house in the village for several summers. And she came to see us during the time that we were not in the ghetto, but before that, and bring food and everything. Came to mother, and she was desperate for money. And mother gave her the money, which the courier was supposed to get. But he didn't arrive anyway. So when the ghetto, we heard, and you always heard these things, that the ghetto was surrounded in 1943. And that was to be...
Warsaw Ghetto.
But this was also the Złoczów ghetto. And that was supposed to be, the ghetto was supposed to be replete. All the Jews were supposed to be eliminated in our area. I mean, as children, we knew something was going on, but we didn't know exactly what was going on. We just knew it was very scary. And so father found us another hiding place, next to where we were living, outside the ghetto. And what I now know, which I did not know then, is at that point that he kind of gave up, and he had cyanide for all of us. And literally, at the last moment, Hela Szczeszewska, and by the way, her name is listed now among the righteous in both Yad Vashem and the Holocaust Museum here, came and she said, "Come with us, and I'll hide you." But she thought the war would be over in a few weeks. But I do remember the walk from our hiding place to Helena's. It was about 4 or 5 miles. And the idea was that we were a group coming from church on a Sunday evening, and we all went there. And Hela did hide us for quite a few months. And there were some hair-raising situations during that 15 months. And looking at it, it was absolutely incredible that the Germans did not find us. But it was a village, and they didn't find us.
And she, as you mentioned, is listed among the righteous. Oh, what a righteous person she was.
Yes.
And it was very dangerous for her to hide.
Oh, she would have been killed. We would have been killed. She would have been killed. And the 2 other people who were a friend of her called Misha, and then Chris or Rzesz, and they're also, and Rzesz is also mentioned in Yad Vashem, because they risked their lives, no question about it.
That's where. So, when I could ask you forever about this experience, but at least we can move to the end of the Second World War now. It finally ended, and in 1946, you and your parents and your maternal grandmother, Bessie, were able to make your way to New York, right, with the aid of the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society.
So then,
HIAS, yes. So maybe just before that, what became of your other grandparents?
I was about to tell you that we heard that the grandfather, that is our paternal grandfather, did take cyanide and did kill himself on the way to a camp. I'm sorry, did you hear me? Yeah, I would say it again. The grandfather, Leon, we were told by an eyewitness that they used the cyanide that the whole family was provided with, and did not let the Germans capture him.
He was about to be captured.
He was, we will understand, this is secondhand, of course, on a truck on the way to a camp. And he took the poison, yes.
I mean, because this is a discussion about also passing things on. I mean, you were living this, but you were also children. So your parents were being very stoic throughout and trying to protect you, but you were also very much exposed to the horrors, the fear. How much did your parents tell you about your grandfather at the time and what became of him and the circumstance, or was this something that you found out much later?
It was a grandmother we saw die. The grandfather actually took a while to find out about. Yeah. But when we were in hiding, and there were 9 of us, by the way, there were other people there with us. There was another little girl, and then there was a young man about 7 years older than we were that worked very hard with us, teaching us and working with us. And we knew what was going on because the wood behind our hiding place was an execution ground. So we could hear the shots. And there were 9 of us in one room where we were hiding. There was one bed which my grandmother and I shared. And it was a 4-poster. So I had these nightmares that I could see devils dancing on the ends of the 4-poster. But the worst thing was that they had built a tunnel from our hiding place, about 3-4 feet in diameter. And there was a porch, and there was a wardrobe, like the Lion, the Witch, and the wardrobe. One of those wardrobe, you lifted up the plank, and you climbed under it. And then when there were people in the house that were not friends, we had to crawl into that hiding place. And I'm claustrophobic to this day. And sometimes you had to stay in that for quite a while. So there was a limit to what our parents could protect us from. But the fact that they were there, and my sister was there.
You were living not in a ghetto, but in a home. Was there enough to eat, or?
I don't remember being hungry, but I do remember not liking the food. Yeah. Yeah, I don't remember the details, but I know to this day I can't eat cornbread. You must have had a lot of corn. Do I like corn on the cob? But I should say that we did have some harrowing experiences. For example, on some of our walks, when we were escaping, I remember seeing rows of graves of soldiers. They were buried in the park. And I think the most harrowing experience was after the first action. You remember that, right? There was, in this new apartment we had, there was a semicircular balcony. And we were at this end of the balcony, and a childhood friend was at the other end of the balcony. So we were allowed to go and see her. We could also look into our apartment because the windows looked out that way. But anyway, after the first action, when we came home, there was a body of a man lying there. And we all saw him. And he was there for a few days because they were afraid to move him. And the young man that Selma referred to, who was in hiding with us, was our cousin Fred. His father had been picked up in that first action, but hadn't come back. And Fred thought that was his father. As it turned out, it was not. His father had one of these incredible escapes that you hear about, crawling out of the ditch and all that. But then he died of a heart attack a few years later. But a few months later. But I remember the sight of that body. And the reason I brought it up is you're asking the impact it had on us. I don't know if at that age we had the concept of death, but I think we knew something terrible was happening. And seeing that body was disorienting.
Time travel. The war ended and you found yourself in New York.
Right.
How old were you then? You were
10, 11.
11 and you were 10. Okay. So that must have been quite an adjustment, although perhaps also a relief. I mean, how did that feeling of security that you described, Selma, at the beginning, did that return being here and being so far away from the horrors of the Nazis?
Yes. I mean, it was, the thing is that the war started when I was 3 years old. I really thought that was the norm. And when I came to the United States, this was really the promised land for me. And it still is. As you can probably tell with my discussions with my children and grandchildren, who say sometimes things are not quite right here, we are prejudiced against these people. And I said, guys, you don't know what you're talking about. I mean, this is the promised land. And here at age 87, I still think so.
This is not to say that we disagree with our children that some things could be adjusted and fixed and reorganized, but overall, this place is absolutely the top, the heap. Now, I've never lived in France or Switzerland, but I don't think they have the heterogeneity that we have.
That's right. Well, speaking of heterogeneity, I mean, you came and you probably didn't speak a word of English, unless your parents or that young man was teaching you English, hiding. No. So how did you adjust, and how did you learn the language?
It was very fast.
Fast?
Yes. I remember going, my father taking me to school. I was due for 5th grade. They said, we put her in kindergarten. She doesn't speak English. Father says, no, you keep her and put her in the 5th grade. But that was in June. And so we just played on the street with the kids of the summer. And once I got to school, within the first few months, I spoke English, but always with an accent, I haven't gotten rid of that yet. But it was effortless.
You?
Exactly the same story. Our first home was in Brooklyn. A relative, Churchill Clara was her name. She was a kind of picaresque character, and she gave us one. She only had about three bedrooms. She gave us one. She had 11 cats in the other one, and she and her husband were in the third. And it was one of these row houses, and we would go down on the street, and we'd hang out with the kids, who were very nice. And as Selma says, we picked up the language somehow. Now, bear in mind that we were literate in Polish. We could read and write very well. We knew math, or at least arithmetic. So, and we probably knew more geography and history than most American kids. But it was, apart. But the language, as Selma says, by osmosis, it just came.
And when a child would ask you, where is your home? Where are you from? How would you answer that question?
Very, very literally, we come from Poland, but we had to leave.
I mean, both of your parents were they were professionals. I believe they did have to struggle when they came here to make money, they were no longer able to work as lawyers, right?
Right. The law degrees were useless. So mother eventually, father initially had some very good jobs with HIAS and the Federation for Polish Jews. And I think he left the Federation because it was eventually became allied with the then government of Poland. And father, of course, was very anti-communist, as well as American-oriented, of course. So my father took a job as a cashier at the automat. And at the same time, he went back to school, and he was able to get an MBA at City College. And mother, with not a long story, but with a family friend whose name was Morris Hennis, opened a deli. And they served, obviously, the community, but they served at tables also. So they did that business, I think, for about 6 years. And then father got, some very good work, and things really turned around.
Wonderful. And I think throughout they insisted, they homeschooled you, they insisted on your education, and you ended up becoming a psychiatrist. I think you went to Barnard, and how did you manage to achieve that? That's actually quite remarkable. And then I'll get to you, Selma, because it's also very remarkable.
Well, it's not fair because Selma had more math brains than I did. I think that we were well educated to begin with, and we were fortunate in running into good public school system. But then Selma, in the seventh grade, took an entrance exam for Hunter High School, and she got in. And from then it was...
Hunter High School is
fifth schools that you have in New York City that you have to take tests to get into.
Uh-huh.
And
wow.
They didn't talk feminism, but they lived it. They really encouraged us to get educated, to pursue careers. And I got in the next track, which was the the high school.
Right.
Yeah, someone started in the seventh grade, and I started in the 10th. So we were both at Hunter, and then we both were at Barnard, and I stayed at Barnard. And, that's a story, too. I was prepared to go to Queens College because at that point our parents didn't have the resources for a private school. But one of my mother's customers was Virginia Gildersleeve, I think, who was a history professor at Barnard. And she got my mother to tell her our story. And this woman said I should go for an interview at Barnard. So I went and got a scholarship.
Amazing.
And then, applying to medical school, by the way, was not in those days as melodramatic as it made sense. I want to make the point. I just happened to find the program of my graduation, and the women were 10% of my class. Now they're more than half. But still, there were no absolute barriers.
Incredible. Well, the barriers that you overcame as children maybe prepared you for the gender barriers that many would have to face, and you overcame. I just wondered at home, because, I've often heard of families of Holocaust survivors that there's either it's spoken about a lot or it's not spoken about at all. Did your parents talk about what had happened, or was it just let's move on? Do you want to?
They didn't, but all their friends were also survivors. So it was always there. You saw that nice little man having dinner, and he was to spend the war in a partisan camp. They were just part of the society. But the idea was we made it to the promised land. And there's one other comment that about the gender barrier. And I did talk to father about it, and he denied it. But I think he gave us a very strong sign that Edith and I needed to have careers that will survive if we have to leave whatever country we are in right now. So she went in, because their law degrees meant nothing. So medicine, okay. Engineering for me, okay. If you have to leave the United States, we hope you don't have to. But there are many other countries that you can practice and become independent.
Okay, so that was the reason. In a way, it was a profession that could help you survive
Right.
any circumstance.
Right.
Interesting. I wonder about you as sisters. Did you?
We never fought.
Never fought. Okay.
I do remember her throwing me out of our bedroom once.
And you never, you eventually got married, and both of you, and you approved each of...
not only got married, we lived together with our husbands and babies, where we both finished school.
Okay, well, I hope the husbands got along.
Yes, they did.
They got along very well.
Wonderful. And one of the results of that marriage we have sitting right here next to you, Mark. I want to turn to you now. And I wonder, growing up in a household where your mother was a Holocaust survivor, at what point were you conscious of that, and maybe even their friends and your aunt, and how did it influence you?
It's such a big and interesting question. I sort of knew you were going to ask it, and I think the answer is sort of never and always. I think it's interesting to mention the family structure. So I'm the younger child, and my sister Lynn is the older child, and Selma has 3 children. The oldest is the same age as Lynn, and then the youngest, the middle one, is the same age as me.
And you were all in the same house together?
No.
For 4 years.
For 4 years, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then the Selma has a 3rd child who's here, and that's Alex's father. So I have often thought, and we've never talked about it really as siblings, and I think maybe someday we will, but that question I don't think we've ever explored. I think that my cousin Debbie, who is sort of my peer, and I always did have an awareness of this, even from a very young age. And I don't even think my parents necessarily know this, but we did go to Hebrew school rather early. And I think one thing, I was trying to think at what age this did, but they showed us newsreels of the camps. And we were really young. And I have sometimes thought maybe that was not a great idea. But we saw them, like age 6 or 7, something like that, that early. So that was, and the stories are kind of in the air. And it can be hard to disentangle at what age you knew what. As you search back, I was thinking when you were talking about your papers, I don't know if you know that I remember your fake name of Danuta Bolska, and I remember you were telling me that. So you must have told me at some point. And all of these stories that Selma and Edith have told, I have heard. And I some of them I know, the one of you jumping out the window, that feels like a story I've known forever and ever. And actually, just fast forwarding, I was recently trying to escort you out of a taxi, and you kind of said, "I don't need your help," and jumped out of the taxi. And I flashed back to that story as a frame of reference. So it's really a tough question to answer. I think the stories were always there, but at the same time, there was really a sense in the whole family of we are looking forward. This is not going to govern our lives. The future is what we want to build, and we want to build it in this country. And at the same time, my mother mentioned a feeling of lost paradise, and I think that was in your mind, I think, sometimes. So that's a bit of an answer, but it's not a simple question.
It is, well, I wonder, because I wanted to ask you, being a mother, putting yourself in the position that your mother must have been in. I mean, did you ever feel like, we're all worried as mothers. I'm a mother too, and we worry all the time. But did you worry more because of your past experience? No.
No, but I did, as someone said, and I echoed, we were very comfortable with this country. I'm sorry. We were, as Selma mentioned, and I echoed, repeating myself, we were very, very comfortable and safe in this country. I was not worrying something would happen to the kids here. But I wanted to say, apropos what we communicated to the kids, that what I actually remember is Lynn, about many years ago, coming to grandfather and saying, could he do a roots project with her? Because when she was in college at the time, and that's what they were doing. And I think that was the point at which we began to talk about this a little more.
Yeah, so
earlier, I think, but yeah.
Maybe earlier, but it sounds like you were getting the stories in kind of fragments, and then at the Hebrew school learning about the atrocities that had happened, the genocide.
Yes.
Yeah.
And when did you piece together that you actually are really lucky to be alive, to be born?
Yeah, I think I still I still am coming to that realization, but I think it's also, my aunt mentioned that my grandparents had a lot of friends, and certainly my cousin and I think everybody had a lot of contact with my grandparents' circle, and they also told these stories. And I think that it really was in the air. So, again, I think knowing you were going to maybe ask this question, I thought my answer really is never and always. It really was in the fabric. And at the same time, the choice was to focus on building the future. That's, I think, the most I can say about that. But I certainly aware of it always. And I say these stories of, my mother jumping out the window and the hiding, I feel like I've known them all my life. I mean, certainly very early in life.
Family lore. I'm just wondering, because you took a completely different career path than your parents or your grandparents. I mean, you're a musician and you're a composer.
Conductor, yeah.
Conductor.
Mm-hmm.
I think you compose too, don't you?
No.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Sorry to that.
a wonderful conductor. No. You're one. Is this just completely random, or is there any link to your family's history why you became an artist?
So I don't think it's random at all. I think, of course, Selma's and Edith's husbands aren't here, but they are very much also part of our backgrounds as this generation. We just had a Seder, and, my Selma's husband and I led the Seder together for years and years and years. My father died a number of years ago. And the melodies that we sing are the melodies that my father knew. So my father's father was a cantor. And I posted he made some recordings late in his life of cantorial melodies that are on SoundCloud now. And so I think and he was very musical in those recordings. So I think that's, the genes come from different paths. And I think also this is a more complicated thing to talk about, but there is something about the practice of music that is the practice of the sacred, as I conceive of it. Strangely, a lot of the music I do is masses and requiems, but there, I think, is that connection to the kind of holy place that my grandfather, the rabbi and cantor, was about. I barely knew him. I mean, he died when I was maybe 4, I think. Yeah.
You're carrying, and that's a way of preserving, but also bringing history that was supposed to be wiped out, but did not succeed.
Absolutely.
To the future. Yeah. That's wonderful. Alex, you're a generation younger than your Uncle Mark, and 2 generations removed from your grandmother, Selma, and your great aunt, Edith. How about you? When did you hear about your family's direct experience with the Holocaust?
I think I have to say something similar to Mark, that, really the shadow of this is so large and ubiquitous that I'm not really sure where it started, but I can recall a little bit of how it changed over time as I know my parents and you explored the question of how do you explain that this happened to a 5-year-old, an 8-year-old, a 10-year-old, and so on. And, I remember those lessons changing from something like, there were some very bad people that chased us out of our home to, the very gruesome reality that my grandmother and my great aunt have done a very good job of retelling today.
How has this influenced you or impacted you once you learned about your family history?
So one of the themes that has stuck out with me the most are the words, "How did I get so lucky?" My grandfather Jack, who's no longer with us, I remember him saying that, and I know everybody else does, through 60 years of marriage to my grandmother. His words are always, "How did I get so lucky?" And I remember also, during your interview with the USC Shoah Foundation, the interviewer asked you, how do you explain your survival? And I remember your response verbatim. It was, dumb luck. I mean, really dumb luck. And I had a really existential moment right then where I came into a deeper understanding of my existence, which I think I now consider a miracle. And now I'm a young man with my whole career ahead of me, and I'm thinking, how did I get so lucky?
That's very beautiful, Alex. And thanks for quoting from the interview, and also to mention that the full accounts of both Edith and Selma's life, there's separate interviews that have been done by the Holocaust Museum that can be seen online.
Just want to comment on what Alex just said. This is exactly what my husband said and my father said. Damn lot, but they did so many things right. But so many other people also did so many things right and didn't work out. And I have this affinity for numbers, engineering mind. Złotów had between 20 and 30,000 people in the years of the war. In the beginning, 20,000, and then a lot of Jews from other communities was sent into Złotów. And roughly 1/3 of the population was Jewish. And this is something that I was told, I don't know, obviously, is that when the Germans left, out of all of those Jews, somewhere between 10 and 15,000, there were 70 left, of which those 70, there were 6 children. And Edith and I were 2 of the 6 children. You know, it is so inconceivable, isn't it? So I think that we were the only family we lost grandfather and grandmother, but the fact that mother and father and 2 children survived was very unusual.
It's 2 out of 6 children. I mean, maybe just one final thought. Does that leave you with any sense of guilt that you were the 2 and the other 4 didn't?
I'm glad you asked that question, because I am taking the position that to have wished that the Nazis had 5 more victims makes no sense to me. I just wish more people had been saved. As Selma said, we were just at some end of the statistics, but not at anybody's expense. As I said, I can't understand, wishing that more of us had been killed. But if you give me another moment, I'd like to add bases to these numbers that Selma just cited. I wanted to bring this up. I can think of 2 kids who didn't make it, 2 children that we used to play with. One of them was a little boy who was the young brother of my best friend, and who lived across the hall, across that balcony that I mentioned. So one day I came out on the balcony, and he was there hanging from the railing, about to jump down. So I grabbed him and screamed, and of course the nanny came out and peeled him off. That kid did not survive the war. He and his grandmother were murdered by the Ukrainians who supposedly sheltered them. And another was a little girl who lived down the hall also. And she and her family escaped to the forest. 1 member survived and said they had all been murdered by Ukrainian bandits. So 2 playmates in the same building were among the victims.
Makes it very personal. I think I'd like to end on one note. You mentioned Helen.
Yes.
What became of her, and were you able to remain in contact?
We were in contact. Our parents were in contact. We were in contact. Our parents were in contact. And she had a husband who was questionable, shall we say. He was on the German side. He figured that if the Germans won, okay, he would dump his wife. But if the Allies won, the fact that she had Jews would save his life, which was true. So she lived, after the war, we were in touch with her, and she died of natural causes. I just wanted to add something when the question about the 6 surviving children. Of course, one of them won the Nobel Prize in chemistry. So you sometimes think, what was lost? Not only in the 6 million Jews, but all the other Holocausts and all the other countries. So I sometimes think of that.
I can imagine. Alex, would you like to add one last thought? I mean, maybe on what you've heard today.
You know, I think hearing these stories growing up has inspired a lot of what I do right now. More recently, I've started a project with a very close colleague and friend of mine who is also descended from Holocaust survivors, and we called it Zikaron, which is a Hebrew word for memory. And what we've done with that is, you know, both of us had this shadow in our lives. So taking that and creating this, I guess, a candle, and then, you know, sharing that with the world and saying, gather around our fire so you can feel a little bit warmer, because there are a lot of people from many different walks of life who are carrying the weight of something that has either happened to them, their family members, or their ancestors.
What do you think, Mark, when you hear that, the shadow that he's creating to help others?
I think it's fantastic, and I'm so glad Alex was able to be part of this today. I would say for my own activity, I also think a lot about, in Judaism, there's the concept of tikkun olam, of healing the world, and that you want, I think something you said, Melissa, earlier, of never again, I think is on my mind almost every day, I think in one way or another, as to try to look for opportunities, even in my line of work, to communicate this message. So I gave an orchestra concert on Sunday, and I spoke to the audience and told them this event was taking place, and I gave them the link, and I said that they could watch it, and that this was an important context in which to think about the kinds of thing that we do. So I think there is something about putting beauty into the world that ought to be meaningful, and also that vigilance is part of what we want to be about.
Right. And I think anyone watching this conversation and listening to your stories would also echo even louder the refrain, and never again. So Edith and Selma and Alex and Mark, it's been such a privilege to have you with us here at the United Nations headquarters today for this conversation. And thank you for sharing your stories. Thank you. It's been incredibly inspiring. Thank you very much. Goodbye, everyone. Stay safe, and never again.